Imagine being judged instantly, not for who you are, but simply for how you look. Now imagine the shock when that judgment backfires in the most unexpected way. Aisha Thompson was just like any other expectant mother, full of hope and dreams, carrying the life of her first child. She was intelligent, confident, and always carried herself with grace. On a quiet evening, she was heading home after a long day, the glow of her pregnancy and the thought of her loving husband waiting for her filling her with warmth. But on this day, something unusual happened, a moment that would alter everything. Isha was in a simple, unassuming outfit, her hand resting on her belly as she made a quick stop at a gas station. Lost in thought about her future child, she barely noticed the patrol car pulling up beside her. And then she heard a voice laced with condescension, judgment, and an unsettling undertone. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here?" Aisha turned around, a bit startled, to see Officer Bradley, a man who already looked at her with something more than just curiosity in his eyes. This wasn't a typical conversation. There was a bite to his words, an unspoken accusation. As she replied calmly, trying to understand what had prompted this intrusion, she felt a chill. Something told her this was not just a casual question. There was something darker behind it. Aisha could sense the officer's gaze trailing over her, dissecting her appearance in a way that made her feel small, diminished, despite the confidence she carried. She took a slow breath, reminding herself to stay calm, to not let this intrusion rattle her. In moments like these, she often remembered her husband's words. "Stay composed. Let them underestimate you. The truth speaks loudest." But tonight, that felt easier said than done. Officer Bradley stepped closer, adjusting his belt and giving her a look that felt more invasive than protective. The quiet tension in the air was only made thicker by his silence, his unspoken judgment evident in every shift of his expression. "So what brings you out here, ma'am?" he asked again, his tone heavy with suspicion. Aisha noticed his glance at her modest clothes, her hands resting protectively over her belly, and the simple car she drove. A vehicle that wasn't flashy or particularly new, but was reliable in hers. She could feel his assumptions working, layering and twisting, as if she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Aisha held her ground, looking him in the eye, though the weight of his scrutiny was uncomfortable. "I was just on my way home," she said, her voice steady. "I stopped for gas. Is there a problem, officer?" For a brief second, she thought that might be enough. Maybe he would nod, say something about routine checks, and let her go. But his expression didn't soften. In fact, it grew sharper, and his questions took on an edge that dug deeper, as though he had decided she was guilty of something, even if he didn't know what yet. "Out here all alone at night," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's, interesting." He raised an eyebrow, as if her mere presence was an anomaly. If you have not liked and subscribed yet, please do it as we upload such stories daily to raise our voice against racism. Aisha felt a twinge of frustration rise. She wanted to explain that she was just a woman stopping for gas after a long day. Nothing more, nothing less. But something in his gaze told her it wouldn't make a difference. Officer Bradley wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a stereotype, a story he'd already decided was hers whether she liked it or not. "Where's the father of that child?" he asked, his voice cold and pointed. "Or are you—" The insult, laced so casually in his words, left Aisha stunned. It was a question so loaded with assumptions that for a second she couldn't breathe. The disdain in his tone suggested he saw her as a statistic, not a person. He didn't see her as Aisha Thompson, a respected woman, a loving wife, and soon-to-be mother. No, he saw her as someone he could categorize and dismiss. Aisha gathered herself, forcing her voice to remain calm, though her heart was pounding. "My husband is at home," she replied, keeping her words even, her gaze unflinching. "I was just on my way back to him." Officer Bradley scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "Sure," he muttered with a smirk. "A husband." "Right." That one word, "right," dripped with disbelief, with a kind of disdain that couldn't be hidden. It struck something deep within her, but she held steady. She'd dealt with people like this before, people who tried to diminish her value because she didn't fit into their narrow expectations. But tonight with her baby's future in mind, it felt different. It felt personal. "Listen, officer," she began, carefully choosing her words. "I don't think I've done anything to warrant this level of scrutiny. I'm just trying to get home." But Officer Bradley was already shaking his head, almost as if he were enjoying this, as though the power he held in this moment was some sort of twisted reward. He took a step back, folding his arms, his eyes never leaving her, assessing every inch of her, every detail he could twist. "You know," he said slowly, his voice dripping with mock concern, "it's people like you who think they can say anything and get away with it. But not with me." Aisha's mind raced, torn between anger and disbelief. She felt the urge to argue, to defend herself, to explain that he had no idea who she was or the life she led. But she knew it wouldn't matter. He wouldn't listen. He had already made up his mind about her. So she stayed silent, her hands still resting protectively on her belly, her jaw set. She knew she didn't need to prove herself, not to him, not to anyone. But she also knew this was far from over. Aisha took a deep breath, her hands still protectively resting on her belly, trying to keep calm. But Officer Bradley wasn't about to let her feel any sort of ease. His gaze remained fixed on her, cold and calculating, filled with an unspoken accusation that left her feeling exposed and alone. "So," he began again, his voice loud and intrusive, "where do you live, ma'am?" She answered softly, not wanting to escalate things. "Not far from here. I'm just passing through on my way home." Officer Bradley didn't nod or show any sign of acknowledgement. Instead, he tilted his head, eyeing her suspiciously, as if he didn't believe a word she just said. "Passing through," he repeated with a mocking tone. "Funny, you don't look like you belong here." Aisha clenched her teeth, swallowing back a retort. His tone was sharp, probing, meant to make her feel small. She could sense that he wanted her to flinch, to react. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction, not tonight. Instead, she forced a polite smile, though it took every ounce of strength. "Officer, I'm just here to get gas. That's all," she replied, keeping her voice steady. But Bradley wasn't letting up. He leaned closer, and his gaze shifted briefly to her stomach before darting back to her face, his eyes filled with something that made her skin crawl. "A baby, huh?" he said, his words laced with contempt. "Bet the father is nowhere in the picture. Am I right?" Aisha felt her heart squeeze at the cruel assumption, but she kept her gaze on him, unblinking. "My husband is at home waiting for me," she said, her voice firm. But her words seemed to amuse him rather than convince him. "Oh, a husband now," he chuckled. "Must be some husband if you're out here alone like this." He glanced around, his expression smug, as if he'd caught her in some elaborate lie. "Do you even have a place to live? Or is the street your home?" The words cut deeper than Aisha wanted to admit. The way he said street made it clear he thought she was beneath him, someone who didn't belong in his safe neighborhood. But instead of showing her hurt, she drew in a deep breath, determined to stay calm, though her hands were shaking. "Officer, I assure you," she said, her voice steady, "I have a home, a family, and a life I'm very proud of." But he only sneered, shaking his head. "Sure, sure. All you people say the same thing." He didn't even try to hide the disdain in his voice, and with each passing second, he was only getting louder, drawing the attention of people nearby. A small crowd had started to gather, watching the scene unfold, their curious eyes adding to Aisha's discomfort. The sight of strangers' faces, some whispering among themselves, made her feel even more vulnerable. But in that moment, she decided that she wouldn't let his words or their stares break her. Not here, not now. "What's the real story here?" Bradley pressed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because I don't buy this husband-at-home nonsense. Seems to me you're just another case of someone making poor choices and looking for sympathy." Aisha's patience was wearing thin, but she knew reacting in anger would only fuel his accusations. She took another deep breath, trying to find the right words to end this without causing more trouble. "Officer, I've told you the truth," she said, meeting his gaze with strength. "I am a wife. I am a mother-to-be, and I don't deserve this kind of treatment." For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it quickly vanished. replaced by a hardened sneer. Deserve? He repeated with a mocking laugh. People like you always think you deserve something. Free handouts, sympathy, respect. Well, I'm not here to hand out any favors. Aisha felt her pulse quicken, a mix of anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She wanted to shout, to tell him who her husband was, to watch his face drop in shock. But she held back, telling herself that it wasn't the right moment. Not yet, but the crowd around them was growing, their murmurs louder. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but none dared to intervene. However, the pressure of so many eyes watching made the encounter feel even more intense, amplifying every word Officer Bradley threw her way. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper now, as though he wanted only her to hear his next words. Just admit it. You're lying. There's no husband, no home, just another statistic, just another drain on society. Aisha swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words hit their mark. But she wouldn't let him see her hurt. She looked him in the eye, her voice calm but laced with a firmness she hoped would reach him, even if he was beyond reason. I know who I am, she said, her voice unwavering. I am a mother, a wife, and a human being. And one day people like you will understand that you don't get to decide someone's worth. He scoffed, rolling his eyes, but she saw a hint of discomfort flicker across his face. Just for a second, before he quickly masked it. Sure, let's go with that, he said, chuckling to himself as he turned away slightly, as if already losing interest. But Aisha could feel the weight of his attitude, his assumptions, pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. She felt anger, hurt, and frustration all churning inside her. But above all, she felt a determination rise, stronger than anything else. The crowd, now visibly disturbed by what they were witnessing, started murmuring louder. People were pulling out phones, recording the scene, capturing every ugly word that had spilled from Bradley's mouth. It was clear to them that this wasn't just a routine stop. They were seeing something more, a deeply ingrained prejudice spilling into the open. And as Aisha stood there, amid the whispers and the cold stares, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe this time, things would be different. Aisha's patience had been stretched to its limits. She stood there, feeling the weight of her unborn child and her dignity both being crushed under Officer Bradley's cruel assumptions. It was no longer about one rude man. It was about every moment she had been dismissed, misjudged, or belittled. And as she looked at the crowd forming, she realized she didn't have to endure this in silence. I think it's time to call my husband, she said, her voice steady but filled with an edge. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. Officer Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes. Sure, go ahead, he said with a mocking grin. Call this husband of yours. Let's see him show up. His voice dripped with disbelief, as if he was convinced she was bluffing, and he was ready to expose her lie. Aisha felt her heart race as the phone rang. She was calling not to prove herself to him, but to have support in a moment that had grown far too toxic and demeaning. After a few rings, the familiar, warm voice of her husband, Judge Marcus Thompson, came through the speaker. Hey, sweetheart, everything okay? He asked, sensing something was wrong in her tone even before she could explain. Marcus, she said, keeping her voice even. I need you here. I'm at the gas station on 5th and Main. There's an officer here giving me a hard time. There was a brief silence, then his voice, now calm but filled with a seriousness she knew well. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Hearing her speak with such confidence seemed to unsettle Officer Bradley. He tried to hide it, but a flash of uncertainty crossed his face. However, he quickly masked it with another smirk. Oh, so now you're calling a judge? He mocked, clearly amused by what he thought was a desperate act. What's next? Are you going to tell me the mayor's your cousin? Aisha ignored his mocking laughter, standing her ground. She knew Marcus was on his way, and that gave her strength. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, many of them watching with a mix of disbelief and sympathy. They saw her strength, her composure, and perhaps, for the first time, Officer Bradley's true nature was laid bare for others to see. But Bradley was far from done. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear, his tone dripping with disdain. You think you're special, don't you? You think some husband is going to walk up here and change anything? People like you, you're all the same. You come around thinking you're owed something. But out here, none of that matters. Isha met his gaze unflinching and said quietly, maybe it's time you learn that respect isn't something you get to decide. Just then, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension. Officer Bradley glanced over his shoulder, and his face faltered for just a second. A tall, commanding figure was making his way through the crowd, his expression serious and unmistakably confident. Judge Marcus Thompson had arrived. The crowd murmured, some recognizing him, others simply awestruck by his presence. He was well-dressed, his stance firm and authoritative. The crowd parted, making way as he approached Aisha, his eyes filled with a calm, protective intensity. Officer Bradley's smirk vanished. He hadn't expected anyone to actually show up, much less a man who carried himself with such power. Marcus extended a hand to his wife, and Aisha took it, feeling a wave of relief wash over her as he stood by her side. Is there a problem here, officer? Marcus asked, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. Bradley's mouth opened, but no words came out. The confidence he had earlier was suddenly replaced by a visible hesitation. For a moment he tried to recover, clearing his throat and attempting a casual stance. Sir, I was just performing a routine check. Nothing out of the ordinary. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze unflinching. A routine check, he repeated, because from what I can see, it looks like you were harassing my wife. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the crowd that had grown larger. He forced a smile, though it came off as a grimace. With all due respect, sir, I didn't realize she was connected, he stammered, as if her value depended on her associations rather than her humanity. Marcus's voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. And why should that matter? She's a citizen, isn't she? She deserves the same respect as anyone else. The silence that followed was deafening. Bradley looked around, realizing he was cornered, his actions laid bare for everyone to witness. The crowd's disapproving whispers filled the air, and he could no longer hide behind his badge. Isha held her husband's hand tightly, her strength now reinforced by his presence. She didn't need to explain or justify herself anymore. They both stood there, a united front, their silence more powerful than any words. Bradley cleared his throat, his confidence shattered. I was just doing my job, he muttered, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. Marcus nodded, his voice level. Then I suggest you go back to doing it properly, respectfully, and remember that titles don't give people value. Everyone has worth. For a brief moment, Bradley looked like he might argue, but the crowd, the cameras, and the judge's unwavering gaze held him back. He took a step back, his face pale and defeated. He knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross, and now he would have to answer for it. As Aisha and Marcus turned to leave, the crowd parted again, a silent acknowledgement of the power of respect, unity, and the undeniable strength in standing together. For Aisha, this wasn't just a moment of justice. It was a reminder that while prejudice might strike unexpectedly, dignity and truth would always rise above. And for Officer Bradley, it was a day he would never forget, a day when his own actions betrayed him, and the truth finally, unmistakably, came to light. The crowd, still in quiet shock, watched as Officer Bradley stood, frozen in disbelief. He had spent the last 10 minutes mocking, belittling, and questioning Aisha's integrity and humanity, never once considering that she might be anything more than the stereotype he had formed in his mind. And now he was face to face with a man who shattered all his assumptions in an instant. Marcus took a steady breath, his voice calm but firm. Officer Bradley, you've made a lot of assumptions here today, he began, his eyes locked on the officers. But there's something important you should understand about respect. Bradley shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but still trying to hold on to a shred of authority. Sir, I was just doing my job, he mumbled, his tone defensive. Marcus's gaze remained unwavering. No, he replied, his voice steady. You weren't. Your job is to protect, to serve, and to uphold the dignity of everyone you encounter. Today, you failed at all three. The crowd watched in silence, some recording the moment, their phones capturing Bradley's flushed face, his nervous stance. It was a moment that felt both powerful and raw, a man of true authority standing up not with force, but with integrity. And Aisha, standing beside him, felt a swell of pride in her husband, in the strength he carried so quietly yet so powerfully. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "You see, officer," Marcus continued, "you didn't know who she was, but that shouldn't matter. The fact that she's my wife doesn't make her any more deserving of respect than any other citizen you might meet." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of agreement at the words. People nodded, exchanging glances that spoke of shared experiences, of feeling overlooked, underestimated, and misjudged. In that moment, Marcus was not just speaking for Aisha, he was giving voice to everyone who had ever been treated as less than, simply for existing outside someone else's narrow view. Bradley tried to stand his ground, a flicker of defiance still lingering in his eyes. "With all due respect, sir, I didn't know she was connected," he stammered, glancing nervously at the crowd around him. Marcus tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Connected?" he repeated, his tone cool. "Tell me, Officer Bradley, should respect be reserved only for the connected? Or is it something we owe every single person, without exception?" The officer's face turned pale, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the question. He looked away, avoiding Marcus's gaze, clearly at a loss for words. He knew the answer, as did everyone in the crowd, but saying it out loud would only confirm what was already painfully clear. He had allowed his prejudice to dictate his actions, and now, under the watchful eyes of bystanders and cameras, he couldn't hide from that truth. Seeing Bradley's discomfort, Marcus continued, his voice now filled with an undeniable authority. "This is the kind of respect my wife deserves. It's the respect every person deserves. But today you decided that her appearance, her background, her very existence somehow justified treating her as less than." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of his words sinking deep into everyone present. For Aisha, it was a moment of quiet justice. She stood there, holding her husband's hand, her head held high, no longer needing to defend herself. She had already shown her strength, her patience, and now Marcus had given voice to the truth she had always known. She deserved respect, not because of who her husband was, but because she was human. The crowd's quiet murmur began to grow, a shared sense of validation filling the air. Some nodded, others whispered among themselves, and a few clapped softly, a gesture of support for Aisha and Marcus, a subtle defiance against Officer Bradley's prejudice. Bradley, still looking visibly shaken, finally muttered, I understand, sir. I apologize, but the apology felt empty, mechanical, lacking the sincerity that could only come from true understanding. Marcus seemed to sense this, and he let out a quiet sigh. "Officer Bradley, an apology without change is just words," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of the work you do. And until you understand that, every person you encounter will suffer for it." For a brief moment, Bradley looked as though he might argue, but something in Marcus's eyes held him back. The crowd's disapproving murmurs continued, and he seemed to realize that there was no way out, no way to excuse his actions. Finally, Marcus looked around at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces watching, some with sympathy, others with quiet anger. "This isn't just about today, it's about every moment we choose to see or ignore the humanity in others. Let's make sure we choose wisely." With those final words, he gently took Aisha's hand, guiding her away from the crowd, back toward their car. The people parted for them, a silent acknowledgement of the courage they had shown, and a shared understanding of the message Marcus had left behind. As they walked away, the whispers grew louder, some in agreement, others in reflection, but all understood on some level that something important had happened here. As they reached the car, Marcus turned to Aisha, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. She looked up at him, a mixture of relief and pride shining in her eyes. "I am now," she said, her voice steady. And as she looked back at the crowd, now dispersing, She knew that, while this moment might fade, its impact would linger, an unforgettable reminder of the power of respect and the quiet strength of standing up for what's right. As Aisha and Marcus drove home, the weight of the evening still hung in the air between them, a mixture of anger, relief, and exhaustion. Aisha leaned back in her seat, staring out the window, watching the city lights blur by, her thoughts racing through all that had just happened. She felt Marcus reach over, his hand covering hers gently, offering comfort in the quiet. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. She looked at him, her expression both proud and weary. "I'll be okay," she replied. "It's just, it shouldn't have to be like this, Marcus. No one should ever have to explain their worth." Marcus nodded, understanding all too well. He shared her frustration, her exhaustion. As a judge, he had seen the same prejudice woven into countless cases, the same dismissive attitudes tearing at the lives of good, honest people. Tonight had been a reminder, a painful one, of how much work there was still to do. The next morning, Marcus was up early, already drafting a formal complaint against Officer Bradley. His words were clear, direct, and pointed. He outlined every detail of the officer's conduct, each instance of disrespect and prejudice. For him, this wasn't just about Aisha. This was about everyone who had faced that same humiliation and hadn't had anyone to stand up for them. Aisha watched him from the doorway, admiring the quiet determination in his expression as he typed. She knew how much this meant to him, how deeply he felt about standing up for what was right. And she also knew that this complaint, while powerful, would be just one step in a much longer journey. Later that day, Marcus submitted the report, ensuring it went directly to the precinct's Internal Affairs Department. The complaint, now official, would be reviewed, scrutinized, and investigated, a process that would put Officer Bradley's actions under the microscope. Marcus knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. As days passed, word of the incident began to spread, reaching far beyond the quiet gas station where it had all begun. Videos from bystanders had circulated online, capturing the confrontation, the crowd's reactions, and Marcus's powerful words. People shared the story widely, their voices joining in a growing chorus of outrage and demand for accountability. In the precinct, the video had an immediate impact. Officer Bradley found himself pulled into meeting after meeting, each one stripping away a bit more of the authority he had so carelessly abused. His superiors looked at him with cold, disappointed eyes, and his fellow officers kept their distance, no one willing to defend what had been exposed to the world. Bradley felt the walls closing in. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, and the precinct had no choice but to respond. He was placed on administrative leave, an investigation underway, and for the first time, he felt the sting of accountability. His actions, once hidden behind his badge, were now out in the open for all to see. Meanwhile, Aisha found herself unexpectedly becoming a voice in the community. People reached out, sharing their own stories of prejudice, their own experiences of being judged and dismissed. She listened, offering words of support, finding strength in their resilience. The incident had sparked something in her, a realization that, while she hadn't chosen to be a symbol, she could use her voice to make a difference. Marcus stood by her side, supporting her newfound role as an advocate. Together, they attended community meetings, joined discussions on equality, and met with local leaders to push for real changes. For Aisha, these moments felt like small steps forward, each one a tiny victory in a larger, more complex fight. As the investigation into Bradley's conduct progressed, Aisha and Marcus received word that he would be facing disciplinary action. The news, while somewhat satisfying, didn't erase the hurt or frustration of the encounter. But it was a step, a small but significant reminder that justice, though often slow, could still prevail. One evening, weeks after the incident, Aisha received a letter from someone unexpected, Officer Bradley. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Inside, the words were brief, written in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you for who you are, and that's on me. I won't ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to do better." The apology was far from perfect, and Aisha knew it didn't change what had happened. But it was something, a glimpse perhaps, of growth, of a small realization within the man who had once looked at her with nothing but contempt. She showed the letter to Marcus, who read it in silence, then looked up at her. "Do you believe him?" he asked gently. Aisha thought about it, the weight of the letter still in her hand. "I don't know," she admitted, "but maybe that's not what matters. Maybe what matters is that he felt the need to write it." Marcus nodded, understanding. "Maybe that's enough," he replied softly. As they sat together in their quiet home, they knew the road ahead would still be long. That prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. But they also knew they had taken a step, made a difference no matter how small. And that was enough, for now. The incident would always be a painful memory, a reminder of the world's imperfections. But it would also be a turning point, a moment that, despite the hurt, had brought a new strength into their lives. And as they looked toward the future, hand in hand, they knew that together they could face whatever came next. This story is a reminder that respect and dignity are not things anyone should have to earn. They're basic rights we all deserve. Aisha and Marcus stood up not only for themselves, but for everyone who's ever been judged unfairly. Let's all remember to look beyond assumptions and treat each other with the humanity we all deserve. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more impactful stories. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button and join us as we continue to shed light on the stories that matter. Thank you for watching.